Welcome everyone. Uh, I'll just briefly introduce ourselves. I'm Pallavi, and my colleague Shreyas is here. So our speaker today is Aditya Pillai. So before I hand it over to Aditya for the proceedings, I'll just go over just a brief about us. Uh, we are the Asian Pathfinders. We hold these fireside chats. Today's topic is the past, present, and future of India's climate policy. Uh, and just to start in terms of who we are. Okay, yeah. So just about us, how did the idea come about? It's a platform for scholars, practitioners, researchers to come together and have a constructive dialogue. Our inspiration is President Roosevelt, the US president, because he held these fireside chats during the Great Depression and World War II, and we are also living through unprecedented times. We hold these informal ways of connecting over one specific topic picked every week and on Saturday at 11. So primarily with peers interested in the region of Asia, but wider the world geography also because we are so interconnected. Uh, we are an open forum. Anyone wants to come present, you want to brainstorm on an idea, please do. We definitely encourage young professionals to come and present with us because we want to encourage new thoughts. And we feel that the young professionals do have a new school of thought which needs to be heard. So yeah, that's one of the things. Uh, we want to be an open forum. We want to have a constructive dialogue. We want to share knowledge, and that's why we are going for a wide array of topics that we are presenting. Uh, we, again, like I said earlier, we are a platform to bring academics, researchers, and practitioners together. And we also are trying to figure out, we have had some people reach out to us saying they want to collaborate on research. So if you like any topic that our speakers are speaking about, do reach out to them and they'll be happy to, you can speak to you. And if you can find a semblance where you can collaborate, definitely do that. So how we are executing our idea is obviously we want to create a knowledge repository for the community. The cornerstone of our engagements are the weekly discussions that we hold online on a pre-decided topic. And then we're also working on how we can further our engagements with our community. So contact us is us, but before I pass it on to my colleague Shreyas to introduce Aditya, just a few housekeeping rules. As default, everyone is muted. And if you are not, please mute yourself. You can have your camera on, that's fine. But please mute yourself, it reduces the noise in the background. Another thing is obviously, like I said, we want to have a constructive dialogue. So definitely engage, ask your questions in the Q&A section. We will be taking it on. Shreyas will be moderating this session, so he'll take on the questions as either during the presentation, if there's any burning question, or at the end of the presentation. And just refrain from making any political statements, any very biased statements, just that because we said we want to keep it as an open forum where we get different views together to have a good discussion. So over to you, Shreyas. And okay, sorry about that. Yeah. So over to you, Shreyas, and I'll let you moderate this. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Pallavi. Thank you so much. And good morning, everybody. So I know Aditya since last 7 years. We started our professional career together, probably at IDS as intern. So currently Aditya is senior researcher at the Center for Policy Research, which is a well-known think tank in Delhi, and it is famous for its empirical studies. And currently Aditya is working on very unique topic, which we don't know much about, that is political underpinning of institutions for climate governance in South Asia. He's a part of that project. Under that project, he's looking after comparative studies, that is climate governance institutions in 8 high emission countries. So taking forward from last week's presentation presented by Dr. Dhanashree Jairam, where she spoke about climate change and its effects on geopolitics and geoeconomics. So today Aditya will be focusing on India's climate policy. So personally, which I don't know much about, so I will hand over to Aditya to start his presentation.
Great. Thank you, Shreyas. I'm just pulling up my presentation here. Can you see it?
Yes, Aditya.
Great,
Please
fantastic. So thank you everyone for spending a Saturday morning, an hour on Saturday morning, joining us for this. I know it's a very valuable part of the week, and for you to spend that time on India's climate policy is hopefully a decent investment. I hope this gives you a sense of where India is coming from when it says what it says and does what it does on climate change policy. I was just going through the list of participants, and it's a broad reach. There's a friend who's tuning in from Los Angeles, Shreyas, and it's 10:30 p.m. there. So thank you for that. Also, congratulations on order, I think, to Shreyas and Pallavi for pulling together these fireside chats, and Asian Pathfinders is a new outfit, but it's regularly been getting fairly wide viewership for these Saturday morning events. So the last one was about climate change. Last Saturday was about climate change. It was about the security dimensions of climate change. A lot of things about how countries relate to each other is changing. This is a slightly different take on that issue. This is essentially a presentation about India and India alone, but the focus is the international forces that have molded India's climate policy, because India is actually quite unique. When we think about climate change policy and politicians reacting to climate change and putting together mitigation policy, which is policy to reduce emissions, you usually think of images like Extinction Rebellion, right, in the UK, or you see protests or movements like the Sunrise Movement in the US, and you see this virtuous cycle of public opinion leading to political action. India is not that, right? India actually is far more, when it comes to mitigation policy, it's far more about the international forces that shape its thinking about how to react to various moves in the UNFCCC, which is the international negotiation process, and also a bunch of technocratic choices about how to reduce cost for energy and so on, which you'll see more about in the next few slides. Now, I want to start with the basics because, you know, these calls, these Zoom webinars are wonderfully democratic spaces, but there are people from very many different professional backgrounds. Some of you may not be too steeped in why climate change is important or what's being done to fight it. So let me just start maybe with a few evocative visuals. So why is this an urgent conversation? There is such a thing as a carbon budget. And this is something that started floating around in common parlance in about the last 5 to 10 years, I would say, definitely more so in the last 5, which is to say we only have this much space left to emit carbon dioxide before we get to a point of no return. And the effects of global warming will be so pronounced that we can't roll it back because of various feedback loops and so on and so forth, right? So what does a carbon budget look like now? How much of our budget do we have left to spend? And I think this visual from the Global Carbon Project is actually a very useful one to give us a visual sense. And let me play it here. So this is historical. And this is to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. We are currently already 1 degree over the pre-industrial historical average. And that's about all we have left, right? And we're growing really, really fast. And we have just this tiny sliver at the top that we can use. This is the, I mean, this graph I was really torn about putting here, but this is, I really wanted to show you firsthand what the science says. And this is from the IPCC's landmark, I would say, 1.5 degree special report last year. It's really changed the global conversation, because it told us what a 1.5 degree world looks like, and it told us what a 2 degree world looks like. Right, and I'll just very quickly run you through this graph. There's a lot of text, but just follow me through this. These bars here, this is where we are, like I said, about 1 degree, right? This is 2006, 2015. 1.5 degree is the absolute outer limit of the safe mark. 2 degrees is what we desperately want to avoid, but is baked into the Paris Agreement as the outer limit of what we could possibly countenance. And now here, I just want you to go down, and the colors here. So if it's purple, it's very bad. If it's red, it's pretty bad. If it's yellow, you don't want to be there, but it's slightly less dangerous than, say, purple or red in terms of the impacts and risks. Now, the things, pretty much every known system that ecologically sustains modern society is going to be affected, right? Warm water corals, which means the entire aquatic ecosystem, mangroves that protect very many vulnerable communities from flooding, the Arctic region, Siberia and the Arctic Circle are going through a heat wave right now. The Arctic Circle just yesterday or day before experienced temperatures as high as 30 degrees. And I was telling Shreyas that my home in the south of Karnataka, which is reasonably close to the equator, is actually at this point slightly cooler than the Arctic Circle. Terrestrial ecosystems, coastal flooding, and this is very many cities across the world are going to be affected by this stuff, including, think of New York, Rio, Mumbai, Kolkata, any city you want, Manila. Any major metropolis, because all of them were essentially sustained as port cities. They originated and were sustained as port cities and were plugged into modern trade networks, which is why they grew. And now the very sea that let them grow is their greatest source of risk. So there's a great irony to all of this. But this is just to show you what 2 degrees looks like. And it's high risk across the board for all of these ecosystem services. And various ecosystem risks. We are currently on track, and there's a debate out on this, we're currently on track for between 4 and 6 degrees. So this is right now the best case scenario, right? And I put this complex graph here because I want you to see it firsthand, not what a news site reproduces of these risks, but what the scientists have agreed on and put on an intergovernmental report. So the second thing I want to just clarify is when you see an Arctic ice shelf melting, when you see the Himalayan glacier melting, it's not just that we're losing a valuable and pretty looking part of nature. It is really the fact that these things sustain a lot of human life, right? And I want to reiterate that whenever you think about climate risk, you need to be thinking about the system that particular damaged part of nature is attached to. So here, this is just representative. A lot of people are talking about this, but we don't know if this is actually going to be the case. And this is just one line of effects. There are going to be very many effects because the system is a complex network, not a linear chain. But the Himalayas water the entire Gangetic Plains. The Gangetic Plains of India have about 400 to 500 million people. In this Gangetic Plain, we have all of the major farmland and irrigation systems of the 18th century, most that was built in the 19th century, most that was built in the 20th century. And even today, it is central to global food markets, right? When Indian rice production falls, global rice markets go into a tizzy. And so this is something that we need to sort of keep in mind when global food markets and Indian food markets go up or down, fluctuate. These food prices disproportionately affect the poorest in society. which means you have then a range of political effects such as instability. The democratic channels have to sort of absorb this stuff. So there are very many second and third order effects that we should be thinking about. Similarly, another representative pathway for what flooding in cities would look like. There's infrastructure damage. People rush to insurance markets, but then because damage increases year on year and insurance systems are already under stress, they're going to start charging higher premiums, which means lower protection for lower income individuals, which means eventually people are going to start migrating, particularly if the sea really comes in a whole lot. And that means you're going to start seeing real estate prices change inland. So that's going to be a new land rush away from the sea this time, rather than towards the sea, as we over the last 100 years have been used to. And then finally, investment losses, the city begins a cycle of death, and so on and so forth. Again, representative, hopefully we can avoid all this. This does not have to come to pass, right? So why is India important in all of this? Why is India important? Because India currently uses way less energy than the rest of the world, right? Per capita, India uses about a third of the energy the rest of the world uses and a sixth that the US uses. And this has very important political effects in how India approaches climate change. There are lots of people, and it's a fast-growing economy, or at least it was a fast-growing economy. And that means it is looking for that headroom for growth, and it's trying to make sure that it's able to give people a high level of income, but income is attached to emissions, right? Already though, even at this very, very low level of per capita income globally, which is what, between $1,500 and $2,000, if I remember correctly, we emit 7% of global emissions, and we're already the fourth largest emitter in the world, though a long way behind the rest. Right? And this is, I think, a fairly interesting graph that shows you is essentially the basis of the politics of modern climate change. Look at China and how it's risen since 2000, and look at India's growth also since 2000. And it does represent a fairly large, a fairly small emissions base, but that is growing now very quickly. And so China doesn't really fit into the category of a poor developed country anymore, and it's just sort of emitted its way to the top. And India would also like the opportunity to do that. And that's really the crux of the global politics. See the US and the EU actually decrease their emissions over time, but then historically, they've emitted so much that they're able to be at a higher income level. So this is the crux of the Indian argument, and this is the crux of the argument of the global South in developing countries, right? And here, this is an interesting little projection out to 2040. These yellow dotted lines, which I have inserted, are essentially projections out to 2040, and you see India and China occupies about a third of the total emissions out to 2040, right? So very, very important players. I just want to stress that fact. Now, coming to the gist of the presentations, the middle bit, these are the things to take away from this. Like I said earlier, India is not a country that is moved and motivated by the domestic politics of climate change. Yes, agriculture is important, water is important, but they aren't tagged as climate issues. They are still seen as relatively old developmental issues that persist. Climate is essentially, at least within the corridors of government, seen as an international diplomatic issue. And so international forces have played a very large role in shaping Indian climate policy. And Indian climate policy, the second point, is that it is not about emissions reduction in the first instance. It is about making smart developmental choices, what is called co-benefits in the policy parlance, that allows you to develop unencumbered, but at the same time, reduce your emissions so that you can show globally and for moral reasons that you have changed your development trajectory. So the point is, out to 2040, you are emitting now far less than you otherwise might have if you had, say, just stuck to coal instead of moving to solar, which is actually the cheapest energy. So solar is a great example of a co-benefit because it's cheap electricity and it's very low emissions. It's just a good pragmatic option. And that's the sort of policy choices India makes, right? It doesn't do sudden deep decarbonization. It doesn't set drastic targets. And energy security and cheap electricity are the main movers of what a good deal is for India, right? There are others, of course, definitely not denying that. But then historically, as I will show in the next few slides, that is what has pushed India to do the things it has for mitigation. Again, mitigation is a policy related to the reduction of emissions. And in the end, I'll conclude with something maybe slightly more speculative, but I say that the domestic resonance of climate politics might actually be changing. Sorry for the typo, but the domestic politics might be changing in that it has more domestic resonance now than previously. So this is a story, 4 words to capture each moment of India's climate story. The first moment in the 90s was about justice. Then came the growth after India opened up its economy and plugged into global markets. Then came, after the growth, came the moment of leadership in India trying to maintain a presence on the global stage. And then currently we're in the period of great ambition. So what is justice? This is a period that starts in the early 1990s, and it's a supremely interesting period that is actually defined to this very day how global climate negotiations take place. I just want to start with a bit of a curiosity, but an important one, again, to reiterate the fact that international forces have been quite important, is that the oil shock in the 1970s is actually the proximal cause that led to the establishment of the first renewable energy ministry in the world, which was in India. So right there, you get a sense that there are other deeper motivations for why a country like India with very little domestic fuel resources pushes to be more secure about its energy flows. Rio 1992 is just a landmark moment. The UNFCCC was founded, which is the global negotiation platform. It has over 100 countries that talk every year about how we can get together and reduce emissions. It is a massive collective action problem because nobody wants to bear the cost, right? So India emerged at this point, and it played an important role for about a decade hence, and even to this day, that role has not completely been renounced, of an important voice for the global South. And essentially, its argument was that historical responsibility has to be the #1 parameter for how you assign responsibility for modern day emissions reductions, right? And I just want to show you, this is a graph that encapsulates that argument. This right here shows all of it, right? So this is the years from 1751, that's basically around the time of industrialization, all the way to 2017. The yellow bit is the European bloc. So those are former colonial powers and early industrializers. Other Europe is mostly Eastern European countries, and then there's the United States. These countries, and this is the argument of the global South, countries like India, and for a very long time, countries like China, for all of these centuries, their emissions let them grow very, very quickly. And you can see more than 3/4 of this slide is essentially their emissions. India and China are just this tiny sliver here, and then you look at Asia and the Pacific. And this graph essentially is the central the central data point around which international negotiations revolves. So as the leader of the G77, which is 77 low developed, middle income, vulnerable island countries that are looking to grow, they've said historical responsibility needs to be taken into account. There have been, because of just the fact that India had started growing about this time in the 1990s, the 1991 landmark reforms, as many of you know, India opened up and started growing fairly quickly, privatized, liberalized, so on and so forth. We saw the first stirrings of mitigation-related policy. So the Electricity Act in 2003 was a major nod in the direction of renewable energy policy. I won't get into that, but we can talk about it later if you're interested. And the Energy Conservation Act of 2001, which established an organization that has actually been very, very successful in reducing India's energy demand by increasing efficiency. And so even today, if you look around you, if you're in India, all of the CFL and LED lamps that are extremely cheap and all of us have switched to, essentially is to some extent or to a large extent an outcome of this particular act. And it's led to huge savings. Now, growth. Mid 1990s to the late 2000s. This is a period I think a lot of younger colleagues and friends, Indian colleagues and friends on this call are familiar with. We grew very fast from about the mid 1990s onwards, and you can see this is essentially what is going on in the mind of the national government, right? We are consuming petroleum and other fossil fuels at a much, much faster rate than we're producing it. And this is still the case today. 75% net import dependence. And that is really the motivation for trying to reduce energy consumption. That's one of the biggest motivations for us trying to build out a massive electrical vehicles policy shift, rather, in the coming decade. There's been very many ambitious statements sort of thrown around as well. So this is a question of not having enough on our own shores to sustain growth. This is another slide that just reiterates that it goes beyond oil and talks about coal. Indian coal sustains the electricity grid and has done for a very, very long time, but this coal is now increasingly being imported. Recent policy changes try to shift that, but traditionally a good chunk of the coal we burn to produce cheap electricity comes from coal that's imported. So essentially, this is the story of growth. One of the big things that a lot of people in the international security and relations space will see is that we have very vulnerable supply lines, right? The Indian Ocean sort of juts out, the Indian subcontinent juts out into the Indian Ocean and is a site of major geopolitical contestation. There's the Middle East, there's China, there's the United States. And so there's a bunch of shifting alliances. One never knows when global conflict will break out, and that has been a major motivation, because if you turn off the funnel of energy coming into India, it is a major political and developmental problem. India's always been slightly short on foreign exchange reserves, and if you're buying energy, it costs a lot of dollars, just something that governments don't want to get into. And volatile energy prices in international markets. 3 weeks ago, we were in negative prices. I remember a time in 2010-11 when it was $140 for a barrel, and that just makes it very difficult to plan if you're a government. So this has had a major impact on how India's built its climate policy. It pushed wind, it pushed energy conservation, pushed solar policy. The period of great leadership. I find this picture fascinating. I use this in presentations a lot, mainly because it just gives you a sense of what it looks like inside the room. And this is from the Copenhagen Conference of Parties in 2009, which was a very, very big event in global diplomacy, climate diplomacy. And you just go around the room and you see the table around which leadership ambitions are crafted and executed. Here on this side, you see the emerging giants, China and India sitting side by side, and on the other, and of course Brazil here with Lula, and there's Obama, for whom this was a legacy project in his second year, is sort of gesticulating very vigorously across the table, and it just gives you a sense of how action-packed it is. And there's a story about this meeting that Obama and Hillary Clinton over there just sort of barged in, just as the developing countries are having a conversation about how to position themselves, and said that we need to strike a deal here. Copenhagen was not that successful eventually, but it gives you a sense of the intensity of the room, really. Manmohan Singh and the Congress government came in, and across the board, they wanted to show that India was a solution player, not a problem player in international diplomacy. And they plugged into a very live multilateral conversation about climate change, because there was a great Bali provocation in 2006, where developed countries sort of turned around and said, listen, developing countries are growing very, very quickly. You're emitting a lot. And in the future, you will be the single biggest swing player in determining whether or not we're able to keep carbon emissions at a safe level. So we need you to start committing. And that conversation essentially prompts emerging leadership candidates like India and China to take seriously the idea of instituting domestic climate policy. What we saw a little bit earlier was that we had little things like the Energy Act, the Energy Conservation Act, primarily domestic in nature, but for the first time, the pressure was on these countries to come up with a coherent plan, a policy plan that spread across government and across the economy. Other things that were going on at the time, the India-US strategic partnership, particularly the nuclear deal, again, for us to sort of make sure that our growth could be sustained with adequate energy, various types of defense cooperation, so on and so forth. And so this is the broad international political context in which India begins to start taking climate policy seriously. And so what comes out of it is this national action plan, which is a major push for solar and renewables, which has had long-lasting effects. I don't think anyone will deny it. And then right after, we have, at least in climate circles, what's called the Ramesh moment, where this gentleman here, Jairam Ramesh, the environment minister, basically took the rule book, tore it up, and said, I am willing to reevaluate India's interests. The historical responsibility argument is important, yes, but I also think India should be proactive and sort of reassess how much it commits in terms of an emissions reduction target. And so for India to commit to a target was always a very, very big deal. And now the conversation about committing to a target opened up. There's a lot of stuff about the target that I maybe will just skip for now. Shreyas, what's the time looking like? 10 more minutes? So that's a yes, I'm guessing. You're on mute. You're on mute.
You have 5 to 6 minutes because you have lots of questions to answer.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's not a good sign. Okay. I just want to, I mean, if you guys are interested, I know a lot of you are from the international relations space. But if you guys are interested, there's this book, India in a Warming World, that's come out of CPR, edited by my colleague Navroz Dubash. It has a bunch of great scholars who dissect every single angle of India's climate change policy. Came out last year. It is open access. So if you type in India in a Warming World, Navroz Dubash, you will find a free PDF version that you can read. Here's a section that essentially has pretty much every major negotiator, all the way from Chandrasekhar Dasgupta to Ashok Lavasa to Shyam Saran and other major figures like Ajay Mathur and so on. So do check it out. Period of great ambition, and this is the Modi period, right? Right off the bat, big targets, 170 gigawatts of solar addition, and that is a considerably large chunk of India's total electricity capacity, announced just before, again, note the international facing nature of these announcements, just before Paris. Raised to 450 gigawatts in New York at the UN Climate Action Summit last year, some of you will remember. And so this is a huge ambition, right? And then the International Solar Alliance, which has now very quickly become this a calling card for India's international leadership claims, and is frequently touted in various multilateral fora. The main thing here, and this slide is just to show you how quickly solar prices fell for equipment, and these are photovoltaic cells. This is May 2009, this is September 2012, and it just fell really quickly, a lot of it because of a Chinese glut in production. And so India was able to sort of push ahead with these major targets, mainly because of a very fortunate event that solar prices fell very quickly. Today, solar capacity is about 10%, which is just shy of hydropower. Now, if you remember, hydropower has been the mainstay of Indian energy, was at one point about half of India's energy production. electricity production, and now solar is just about at the same place hydro's of course declined, but then solar has grown so quickly that it can now say that it can compete with the legacy candidate. And renewables are about one third of our total capacity, and coal is half. The big champion of Indian power markets, thermal energy, is about half, renewable about one third. Of course, this is not comparable because coal produces at about 60 to 70% efficiency, renewables about 10% efficiency. So actual electricity flowing through the wires is far less renewable, but just in terms of capacity, this is what it looks like. So with that, Ryder. I showed you this picture very early on, and I was hoping it would sit with you. And it's a very interesting project put together by now a very famous installation artist by the name of Oliver Eliasson. And it's called the Weather Project. And he essentially says engaging with your environment and engaging with the light in your environment has an effect on you. It has an effect on the community, and it has a way of changing politics. And I thought that was a snappy little way of capturing what is happening with Indian politics because of its engagement with solar energy. Here are a couple of interesting examples of how the community engaging with that light reacted to it in sort of political ways. The Indian energy transition, so all that great progress on adding renewable energy, is not apolitical. And I encourage you to go to the India Forum and look at this paper that my colleagues just put out last year, which is the disruptive politics of renewable energy, where it essentially says, there are a bunch of things that are going to change because India is moving to renewables. You'll have to take care of the coal industry. There are regions in India very similar to the United States that produce a bulk of the coal that could experience very, very rapid developmental decline that you need to be able to take care of. Things as unconnected seemingly as the Indian Railways sustains itself on coal, actually, to make sure that railway passenger rates, railway passenger fares are low. And so there's a chain of knock-on effects that need to be reconciled politically. The second point is that manufacturing is now becoming very central to the climate change conversation in India and across the world more generally. But it is a big departure from a country that looked at climate change as an international story, as a diplomatic story. It is now looking at it through the language of jobs, which is important. And because of all the very exciting falling in prices, prime ministers coming out with major targets, this, that, and the other, large public and private companies that have enormous clout and capital, including the great stalwarts of the Indian economy, state-owned enterprises from the 20th century, and new private capital such as SoftBank Energy. Most of you must know of SoftBank and their billions are invested in the renewable sector. But a lot of companies, not SoftBank, but a lot of companies are also invested in fossil fuels. So there's an interesting tension now with a lot of governmental companies such as NTPC and others that are invested on both sides of the aisle, as it were. And this is sort of this emerging theoretical discussion in the literature put forward by people like Matthew Mildenberger at the University of California, Santa Barbara, about double representation. Anyway, with the COVID-19 slowdown, we might be at a point where we have to make a choice, because there is just about only so much energy you can keep adding. Solar has taken the future growth projections, and the base has always been thermal. If the growth is limited, then solar has nowhere to go. So does that mean you're going to retire all our old thermal plants? And that is a major political conversation. Last slide, and I am done. I just want to talk about a future that, to my mind, is unwritten, but also potentially scary. I just want to take you to a comment that has really captured my imagination. I've been sort of boring the ears off my colleagues with this, but the Kerala chief minister came out a couple of days ago and he said, listen, my government has just completed 4 years in office. And it has not been the normal tenure of a chief minister in this country. international colleagues. Kerala is a state in the south of India. And in my first year, I had to deal with Cyclone Oki. In my second year, I had to deal with a great once in 500 year flood. In my third year, I had to deal with what looks like now a precursor to the coronavirus, the Nipah virus, which they managed to contain, as they have managed to do with this one. And then it was the second great flood, and then it was a global pandemic. And I think the nature of governance changes in this way, in that leadership and being the head of state or head in an office of responsibility is increasingly going to be about reacting to short-term disasters and just trying to keep this teetering ship of economy afloat. And here are some of the things that I think are important in thinking about the next decade. There is a lot of national, state, and private debt right now, and very little economic growth. That could pose a problem, in the great renewable transition, but also in building just the nuts and bolts of dealing with climate change. The university departments, long-term funding for research projects, right? Funding NGOs, all even funding hydromet services and modeling satellites, all of that stuff. And the third bit is a psychological component, which is what are the priorities of government? It is going to be about growth now and fast. Are we able to, in that psychological framework, think about a future 20, 30 years hence and make pragmatic decisions? Or is the overwhelming force of current day politics going to push back against that sort of long-term pragmatic thinking? You can read about this in an op-ed I put together about perhaps a lost decade of preparation in the Hindu on 12th June. It's called A Convergence of Crises. Hindu is behind a paywall, but the first 20 articles are free. And finally, I just want to go back to that graph. And Shreyas, this is the last bit, nothing more. But just here, India and China in 2040 is about a third. And honestly, it is important, I think, that climate change becomes central to their bilateral relationship, and they find a way to cooperate on this. Right at the very moment, things are looking pretty bad between India and China with a major boundary dispute. But they need to be talking about the Himalayas a lot more. They need to be talking about how they cooperate in the UNFCCC, and they need to be talking about how they fund developing countries in Africa, Pacific Islands, and so on and so forth. They are emerging as major donors. What climate perspective are they going to build into, what climate guidelines are they going to build into their rules for lending? So I will end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aditya, for that amazing presentation, wonderful presentation.
Thanks.
And I thought I will use my prerogative to ask few questions as a coordinator, but now there's so many of amazing questions in the chat box I can see.
Oh, really? Okay, let me take a look.
And I think we can push for another 5-7 minutes past 12.
Okay.
And I will ask you to answer. I'll go through each and every questions. I'll read for you a question, and you can answer. So I'll start with the Shravan's question, where he's asking, with US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, where do we see the global climate leadership moving? Who will lead the global climate policy changes? Can India be a major part of this future leadership? And I can add the small bit in this question. Do we need a leadership?
Okay. Do you want to take a few together? How many questions are there?
We have, I think, almost 15 questions, but we'll go one by one. That would be better.
Fine. So I'll answer very quickly because we have very little time. But so the first bit about the US withdrawing, yes, it is a vacuum. And I think you saw Obama gesticulating. He did a lot to cobble together the Paris Agreement, and it was a major part of his foreign policy legacy. With the US withdrawing, it is an issue. The European Union has traditionally played a very, very important, very consistent role in the UNFCCC process. It is maybe less visible, but it has constantly been forcing countries that engage with it to think about climate policy. And the European Union is very well known for putting conditionalities on its external relations and its trade agreements and so on and so forth. So the European Union actually has a lot of structural power. The US president, for traditional reasons, has a lot of visibility. So that's precisely what you're losing. I think China and India do have a major role to play, and India has consistently been signaling on the world stage that it is taking climate change seriously, and China has as well. Now, whether they will use their political capital to bend emissions trajectories across the world, and whether they will set targets for themselves that set an example, is an open question. I think we'll have to see next year in London, which will be the biggest conference of parties since Paris, where countries ramp up their NDCs, the national determinant contributions, essentially their targets, right? Do we need leadership? Absolutely. I think you have to create a pressure cooker. That is the only way stuff is moved. And I think the pressure cooker is what is central to the logic of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement does not put top-down targets on countries, right? So previous versions such as Kyoto actually set top-down targets on developed countries. Paris says, you come to the table, you tell us what you can do. So for us to meet that carbon budget and prevent like 4 to 6 degrees, which would be catastrophic for our kids and grandkids, all of us, like the next generation, possibly the end of our lifetimes, it is quite important that there is some motivating factor. So beyond just the science.
Okay, thank you. So there are a bunch of questions by Rana Pujari, but I want to give a fair chance to other questions also. So I'll ask one question from it. So Rana Pujari is asking, how influenced is India's climate policy process by research and data?
The word climate policy process is a very broad one, but I would say there has been a very discernible influence, I think, across very many areas, right? So for example, the entire global, the equity argument, right? The historical responsibility argument can, to a great degree, say that one can say that it was crystallized by a landmark paper that was written in 1991 by Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan called, what is it? Global Warming in an Unequal World. And essentially put the Center for Science and Environment on the map, I would think. And it basically said historical responsibility is the most important thing, and India should not commit in any way. Modern day think tanks that emerged in the 2000s and the 2010s, such as CPR, CEW, were in conversation with governments at various levels, state governments, Terry, of course, I can't forget Terry, a big player. All of us are sort of engaged with governments at various levels, talking about how can you craft a pathway that allows you to meet the needs of poverty, but also reduce emissions. And India actually currently has about 35 mitigation-related policies across the country. So it's not like one or two things that I've just highlighted. And a lot of that is just churned from NGOs and think tanks and universities at various levels, because government itself is so hamstrung when it comes to having just the time to think about these things. It's constantly relying on external sources. So I would say actually a fairly big role.
Okay, so there is an interesting question by Chaitra. She's asking, are there strategic shifts in India's approach from Rio 1992 to Paris Agreement 2015 and beyond? Is historical responsibility and ethical narratives still held a priority?
Yeah, I think the big strategic change is that leadership is maybe perhaps more part of the mix. And the big reason there is because we have to remember that in the 1990s, it was a unipolar world, right? The end of history and this and that. And by the 2009s, 2010s, the global architecture changed. And for a second, we started looking like 19th century Europe, with many poles of power contending for legitimacy and leadership. And that has had a major impact on many multilateral issues, including climate change, and of course, things like trade and so on and so forth. So that is actually the big change. But the historical equity argument is I think still very prominent in the psychology of Indian bureaucrats in government today, in the Indian think tank space, in the Indian NGO space, in the Indian media space even, because as recently as 2011, I think 2010, 2011, when India was, Jairam Ramesh talked about the moment when he was talking about India putting up progressive climate targets. There was massive pushback. Right? There was pushback in parliament. So it is important. It is still there. I don't think it's gone. We're not going to tomorrow announce a deep decarbonization target and say zero emissions by 2030. It's not going to happen, at least in my opinion.
There is a question by Divita. She's asking, has migration at all started factoring into Indian leadership's mitigation and adaptation thinking in terms of creating policies, funds, or relocating critical industries, etc.?
This is a really tough one. I'm not entirely sure it has. I have no evidence to suggest that concepts of migration have entered India's climate policy discourse. It is an emergent narrative in civil society discourse. So actually, one of the first things you talk about when you talk about India in 2070, 2080 is what is going to happen to the Northeast. If a quarter of Bangladesh, or whatever it is, David Wallace Wells wrote this paper in, New Yorker, I think, piece basically said half of Bangladesh is going to be underwater. What does that mean for religious tensions and so on and so forth in the Northeast? And that has sort of captivated the imagination, right? If you have a major outflow of people from Bangladesh into India, which is on three sides of Bangladesh, what is that going to do not only for the lives and livelihoods of those migrating, but also for the politics of the surrounding states? And there was an interesting piece that Reuters ran a couple of years ago where it said every flood in Bangladesh, every major flood in Bangladesh leads to an influx of women in red light areas in Kolkata. So they sort of traced the data of the number of women practicing in red light areas in Kolkata, and they sort of established a link. So we're putting the pieces together at the moment. I don't think it's a central part of policy. I don't think migration has traditionally been a very important part of India's governance and policy thinking. As colleagues might agree, but I think the current moment attests that the question of migrants is not really front and center and doesn't sit very well with traditional modes of production that are based on cities and essentially productivity. I think a lot of the conversation has been about that and less so about the resilience factor, particularly for the labor in the workforce. Yeah.
There is a question by Moira. It's asking, in terms of debate on global climate policy, do you see a convergence of objectives between climate concerns and developmental objectives, such as poverty alleviation, or this is still a gap that needs to be bridged?
Great question. I actually see this as being the biggest narrative in current day climate debates, right? You must have followed the Green New Deal, for example, in the US, which is essentially saying, let us marry now industrial outcomes, economic growth with creating a safer, more sustainable future, right? And so that convergence is happening, I think, globally. And even in Delhi now, that conversation is really sparked off a huge conversation. I think traditionally countries like India have always wanted to, had a keen eye on making sure that measures were cost effective, led to employment, and didn't mess up the GDP. I think that conversation is now amplifying in countries like India, but how much it will reach into policy is an open question. Like my final slide suggested, the next 10 years will dictate a lot of what comes in the 30 or 40 years after that. But it is moving in that direction. I don't know if it'll actually hit policy, because if you're in the hot seat today, you really are trying to get the GDP up as quickly as possible, and that might well come at the cost of environmental protections. It might well come at the cost of rational planning for climate change. It might be a very different set of investments than those that are required for climate, just because you want to get these policies out there and working for you very quickly. So it's really a question of, do you want to sustain the old or move to the new? And that's a psychological thing, I think, and that it really depends. I mean, the Prime Minister came out a few days ago and he said, well, green, sustainable, and recovery are three compatible words. So that's from the head of government. Let's see. The narrative is emerging.
Okay. So the Vaishnavi is asking a question that, as you said, the cost of solar energy is falling. Then why there is still traction about coal here in India?
So two things. Very quickly, coal is steady baseload power, right? So it basically runs most of the time, all of the time. And solar is intermittent and intermittent and variable, in the sense that every day and through seasons it moves up and down. And so I think it's just there are a bunch of management costs to shifting to an intermittent and variable energy, right? So you have to build spinning reserves, you have to do hydro, you have to do battery storage and stuff like that. So it takes time. The second thing is, coal is very, very important to Indian politics. Coal India Limited is one of the largest employers in the country. The Indian Railways that transports coal is one of the largest employers in the country. The states that produce coal, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, etc., are politically extremely important and very reliant on coal. And the list goes on and on. And so there is political staying power for coal. It is not going to disappear very quickly. And you have massive companies that have essentially supported Indian growth for 20 years, most of them state-owned, that now have to figure out the strategy for the future. So it is going to be a slow transition process, I think. And again, a very political one.
So there's a question by Vikas. He's asking, what is the role of local governments in this managing the climate issue, like municipalities or the corporations or the panchayats?
The role is huge, and the role is huge because of the Indian Constitution. The structure of the Indian Constitution is that it is a federal democracy, and a lot of governance, I have actually a table somewhere, but I'm not going to pull it up. A lot of governance functions related to climate change are split between three levels of government. So things like water are at the state level. Things like power are split by the center and the state. The municipalities have control over health, water, all sorts of things. Panchayats have a big role to play. So the role is huge from a legal perspective. But the big problem is panchayats and municipalities are highly understaffed. They are, I would think, underfunded, and they are not subscribed to practices of modern good governance. And therefore, there is a lot of capacity building and reform needed to get them to be slightly more focused on disaster. I mean, the place I previously worked, the Asia Foundation, we used to do a lot of work with local governments, particularly in the way back and beyond floodplains of the Koshi River that comes down from Nepal, floods every year. And the amount of capacity and handholding that is needed for these village panchayats, amazing individuals trying to make a better life for themselves and their communities. We were working with women panchayats, but they don't have the resources, they don't have the time. It's a major problem, and I think, if there are colleagues here who are thinking about what to work on next in climate change, I would say that's an area that hasn't been worked on enough at all, and connects to the migration stuff and all of that, right? So it's
yeah. So there's a question on nuclear energy. So the Prajwal Patil is asking, what is the overall sentiments towards nuclear energy, as development in that sector has brought about very efficient and safe systems considering India's main goal is clearing energy dependence rather than climate change. So what do you think about it?
I'm not an expert on nuclear. I know it is a politically uh, sensitive sort of issue. I can only tell you what I know so far. Is that it isn't a major part of the conversation today in terms of India's energy mix, right? I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree with that. I think we've seen a lot of trouble with both the pricing and local resistance to nuclear in India, and it's a very competitive energy market where solar is now coming in. This latest round-the-clock bid came in about 360 rupees a unit, which is far cheaper than nuclear when it starts off. But again, is not an area I want to venture into so much. It's just what I've heard in the narratives I've picked up, really, that I'm regurgitating here.
So, Monish is asking, during the COVID-19 outbreak, power from renewable has overshot coal-based power generation. Trend or temporary phenomenon? So what do you think about it? Is it a trend that the coal
Yeah,
power
great.
has?
No, absolutely great question, right? That's exactly what this question was about, which is we have a decision to make. Um, if if um, if the energy demand goes down, are we going to pick old thermal plants that we've been trying to phase out for a long time, or are we going to build new solar plants and phase out the old ones? So which is the, and it's a political question ultimately. Like I said, I mean, the transition is a political one. I will say this: the signals from government have actually been fairly positive over the last 2 or 3 months. They moved very quickly. I mean, one of their first major policy decisions after the lockdown was essentially to make sure that renewable energy developers felt safe and happy, right? And they have consistently pushed in that direction. Like early April, they conducted a 2 gigawatt bid for renewable energy. There was a lot of symbolic sort of signaling stuff about it. We are very serious about renewable energy, and there have been some major strides in the last few weeks in terms of discovering all-time low prices for round-the-clock renewables, which is renewables combined with battery storage, came in at a very cheap price that was competitive with coal. So now the intermittency and variability argument is potentially out the window. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not a simple narrative that, okay, you know, the government supports thermal and renewable energy is this insurgent upstart that needs to fight. It's actually more complex than it. And policymaking is actually right now at a very interesting stage.
That's the next question was more or less related to the same question which I earlier asked about the India's capacity of building up renewable energy. I think you mostly answered that question because it's a more policy side of thing.
Yeah.
And as you said, batteries. I was thinking about Afghanistan, which is like Saudi Arabia of lithium. They have a large amount of lithium in Afghanistan. It's a good friend of us, so we can go there for the lithium and further. So,
sorry, Shreyas, I just want to say in this, there's a very captivating little line in Disruptive Politics of Renewable Energy, this paper by my colleagues, where they say India is going to move from fossil fuel imports to technology imports. And that's a whole different set of geopolitical questions and a whole different set of countries that we need to be friends with and please on a regular basis.
So yeah, so there is a great number of questions we have here, but I would ask our participants if they have many more questions, so they can reach out to us, and we will share those questions with Aditya and get back the answers to you. And Aditya, if you have any last words about, so the floor is yours.
No last words. Once again, thank you for sort of organizing this. I'll just put down. I realize can you type into this? Can you see this whiteboard?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is my email. cpiindia.org, and this is my Twitter, and you can just reach me at any time on either of these things.
Okay, thank you so much, Aditya. So,
all right.
You can see Aditya's email ID and Twitter handler over there. So you can reach out to him directly if you have any questions. So thank you so much for joining today. This is the fourth session we have conducted right now of Asia Pathfinders.
Right.
Next session will be on China. Avinash Godobole, he's a professor.
Oh,
He will
nice.
be joining us next Saturday and discussing Chinese Communist Party and its evolution and what kind of powers they hold and etc.
Oh, fantastic.
And on 27th, we'll continue with the China sessions where Kalol Bhattacharya will be joining us.
Very good.
So I'm looking forward to see you all for the next session. Thank you so much and
All right.
have a nice weekend ahead.
Thank you, everyone.